Welcome to Heart of Terra Stories. Please subscribe to my channel. Your one click means the world to me. The blade was a sliver of refracted light, humming as it hungry for her throat. Empress Solara didn't blink. She didn't have time. But Kalen was already there. He didn't just move. He blurred. A glitch in the visual field of the highborn guests. One moment he was the clumsy Terran consort with the awkward gait, and the next he was a predator wearing the skin of a diplomat. His hand caught the assassin's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone, his other hand driving a dinner stylus into the killer's jugular with a precision that was strictly illegal. 28 seconds to change the fate of a galaxy. That was all it took for the masquerade to die. The evening had started with the suffocating grace of Aurelian tradition. Ethelgard floated among the clouds, its crystalline spires catching the dying light of 3 suns, casting long amber shadows across the great hall. Solara felt the familiar itch of her ceremonial robes, heavy, stiff, and embedded with microgems that tracked her vitals. Beside her, Kalen looked exactly as the hegemony expected a SETI 9 primitive to look. He tripped slightly over the hem of his tunic. He fumbled with the silver chalice. He smiled with a wide, harmless vacancy that made the High Ministers sneer behind their fans. Truth is, the marriage was a cold calculation. SETI 9 was a dust-choked rock, a backwater outpost that offered nothing but a strategic buffer zone against the Void Reich. Solara had accepted the union to project an image of inclusive stability, never once imagining that the man standing at her shoulder was anything more than a political prop. She'd spent their 3 months of marriage treating him like a stray pet kindly, but with a distance that bordered on dismissal. The weight of a crown is nothing compared to the weight of a secret. As the gala reached its peak, a flickering distortion ripple moved through the crowd. Solara recognized it instantly. A phase shifter. The hegemony's sensors were supposed to be impenetrable, yet here was a Void Reich shadow agent standing 10 feet from the throne. Panic began to rise in the hall, a collective gasp that felt like a vacuum. Solara reached for the emergency pulse trigger on her belt, but her fingers found only empty air. Then she felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. The man beside her, the one who had spent all evening struggling to pronounce excellency, suddenly stood perfectly still. The clumsy slouch vanished. His spine went rigid, and his eyes, usually a dull, compliant brown, sharpened into something cold and analytical. Before the phase shifter could fully materialize its weapon, Kalen spoke. It wasn't the broken dialect of a SETI 9 minor. It was a sequence of harsh, rhythmic syllables. Imperial war codes, redacted for 3 centuries. Ghost protocol active, he whispered. He moved like a shadow in a room full of light. He didn't run. He flowed through the panicked crowd, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. He intercepted the assassin mid-lunge, his movements possessing a terrifying efficiency that the Aurelian guard couldn't hope to match. Solara watched, paralyzed, as her simple husband dismantled a Tier 1 killer with his bare hands. There was no hesitation, no waste, just the raw, brutal application of a combat style that shouldn't exist. As the assassin slumped to the floor, Kalen didn't relax. He stood over the body, his breathing steady, his gaze scanning the rafters for secondary threats. He turned back to Solara, and for the first time she saw the man behind the mask. The deception was a masterpiece, but the reality was a nightmare. The silence that followed the snap of the assassin's neck was louder than the screaming had been. Kalen stood amidst the scattered crystal flutes and spilled nectar, his posture no longer that of a clumsy consort, but a weapon sheathed in silk. Solara felt the cold pull of the vacuum in her chest. Everything she knew about the man she had married, the soft-spoken minor, the awkward laugh, the gentle hands, was a lie. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling as the Aurelian guards finally closed in, their pulse rifles leveled at his heart. Kalen didn't raise his hands. He didn't even look at the guards. His eyes stayed locked on hers, stripped of their stage dullness. "A ghost," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a gravelly, resonant tone she'd never heard. "And your only chance of seeing another sunrise. Truth is, the hegemony had been blind. They had looked at the Terrans and seen a dying race clinging to a radioactive rock. They never looked for the Shadow Fleet. They never suspected that SETI-9 wasn't a colony, but a front for a superpower that had been perfecting the art of the invisible war, while the Aurelians were busy polishing their crowns. The heavy doors of the great hall buckled. A second wave of phase shifters began to bleed through the air like ink in water. The Void Reich wasn't sending a killer. They were sending an invasion. "Solara, listen to me," Kalen said, stepping toward her despite the weapons pointed at his head. "The war codes I used just opened a back channel to the Terran 7th Fleet. They're 5 minutes out. But if you don't authorize the Joint Defense Protocol now, your ships will fire on mine, and the Reich will pick through the wreckage of both." "You lied to me," she said, the betrayal stinging worse than the threat of the blade. Every touch, every word. It was all part of the Ghost Protocol. He paused. For a fraction of a second, the predator vanished, and the man she thought she knew looked out through those hard eyes. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek, a ghost of the intimacy they'd shared in the quiet of the lunar gardens. "The mission was the lie, Solara." "The rest, that was just me." She looked at the chaos unfolding, the shimmer of the rice blades, the terrified faces of her people. She had a choice: cling to the pride of a dying empire or trust the man who had dismantled her reality in 28 seconds. "Stand down," Solara commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of 1,000 years of rule. The guards hesitated, then lowered their rifles. She turned to the console behind the throne and slammed her palm onto the interface. "Authorization code Aurelius 1. Link the tactical grid to the Terran signal. Give them everything." The sky outside the crystalline domes ignited. It wasn't the fire of an explosion, but the blinding white light of 100 Terran dreadnoughts folding into local space. They didn't move like the elegant Aurelian frigates. They were slabs of jagged metal and raw power, bristling with kinetic batteries that tore the Void Reich stealth ships out of the stars before they could even scream. Hours later, as the smoke cleared from the spires of Ethelgard, Solara stood on the balcony overlooking the burning wreckage of the invasion fleet. Kalen stood beside her, his formal tunic torn, his knuckles bruised. The facade was gone forever. There was no going back to the simple miner and his empress. "What happens now?" she asked, watching a Terran shuttle descend toward the palace. "Now," Kalen said, looking at the horizon where the 3 suns were beginning to rise, "we stop pretending. We build something real." He reached for her hand, and this time there was no stumble, no hesitation, just the solid grounding weight of a partner who had walked through the fire to stand by her side. The secret had been heavy, but the truth, brutal and raw as it was, felt like the first breath of fresh air she'd taken in years.